Thanks, everyone, for joining us at the Project Censored Radio Show. We're very glad to welcome to the show Juley Fulcher, who's a worker, health, and safety advocate for Public Citizens Congress Watch Division. She is a lawyer and a psychologist who has worked for 20 years as a policy expert in Washington, D.C., the belly of the beast. Juley, thanks so much for joining us.
Happy to be here.
So I wanted to give folks some context of this report, and you can find the report up at citizen.org. It's a very powerful report called Scorched States. And I just want to share some findings from that that was released in May of this year. It's basically a report card on state laws protecting workers from heat. And so as pointed out in this report, globally, nearly 500,000 people die each year because of extreme heat. In 2023, the Northern Hemisphere experienced its hottest summer in 2,000 years. As many as 2,000 workers die, and 170,000 workers are injured from laboring in extreme heat every year in the United States. Worker heat stress tragedies disproportionately strike workers who are poor, Black, and brown, like any other stressors in our white supremacist capitalist system. So with that framework, Juley, I want to first highlight something that you show in the report, that only 5 states out of the 50 have some workplace heat stress rules in place. That's California, Oregon, Washington, Colorado, and Minnesota. And listeners who know geography might notice that 3 of those states are in the northernmost part of the country, and totally absent are southern states. So, Juley, could you talk about, in some more broad strokes, could you talk a little bit about what kind of heat legislation these 5 states have, and if you feel that it is enough to deal with this climate chaos that we're experiencing right now?
Well, the protections that workers have in those 5 states vary quite a bit. We do have rules in Oregon and California that are particularly strong. They cover both indoor and outdoor workers, and actually California has just recently begun to cover indoor workers. They've covered outdoor workers since 2005, but both Oregon and California have very strong rules that are clear about what it is that employers need to do, specifically making sure that workers are hydrated and have adequate time for cool down breaks. That new workers are acclimatized during their first week so that it's not overwhelming, that all workers and managers get trained on the dangers of heat stress and how to recognize heat illness when it starts to occur, how to respond effectively. And so those states have served as a great model for something that should be done. At least in terms of the structure of the rule itself. Washington State also has a good rule in general, although it only covers outdoor workers. Minnesota, unfortunately, is a very brief rule, and it only covers indoor workers. Colorado is a rule that only covers agriculture workers, but it does have some good items in it that are protective of workers.
And I'm curious, I mean, this might be more of a psychological question, but it seems to me that it would just be easier to offer up a kind of sweeping legislation that says, okay, workers, whether they're indoor, outdoor, whatever the case may be, you're protected. Here are the protections, whether they be water breaks or ensuring that you have access to cool spaces, rather than nitpicking like, oh, well, if it's above 85 and you're outside and there's shade, it's like, why is there so much distinctions and little nitpicking red tape here?
Well, some of it has to do with the obvious kind of push and pull that happens when they're developing a rule from stakeholders on both sides, those advocates working on behalf of workers and the workers themselves, and then some of the industry groups that struggle to try to minimize any regulation of workplaces. And so that's where some of it comes from. But a lot of it is there because specificity is necessary in order to get employers to do what needs to be done. This is a complex issue, and it's something that we can't expect every individual employer, especially small businesses, to, become experts on and figure out all of those things. And that's why it's very helpful to have things like trigger temperatures where it says, when it's above this temperature, you do this. And if it reaches this temperature, you do that. Um, uh, uh, so some of it is actually very helpful to the employers, meaning it's also very helpful to the workers because it gets implemented correctly.
And one of the things that you mentioned there in the report is this acclimatization, like the importance of making sure that people can get used to a situation. And I thought about that because I myself am very sensitive to heat. I was not made for the age of climate change. And in the past, I have worked in, like sound audio tech. And there have been some moments, particularly when it's outside, where other people seem to be doing fine, but I am just I can feel that I'm like very unsteady on my feet. How does that play into that kind of legislation? I mean, like the kind of personal experiences that somebody might have if they're more sensitive to the heat, or perhaps there's like a disability that makes them more likely to suffer from heat exhaustion. Where would that fit in?
Well, obviously, that's something very difficult to account for. We're all individuals. We all have different sort of physical capabilities when it comes to heat, different sensitivities. And it's not something that an employer can adequately address. We can't sort of figure out where every individual person's needs are and make sure that they each have the different kinds of things they might need to be protected. Instead, what we create in these rules is something that would cover the average person, and make sure that they are protected from the heat. But something like acclimatization does recognize that there is some degree of tolerance that can be developed in order to get you into a condition for working in the heat. And that's why we say for the first week or so, you should have increasing amounts of time working in the heat in order to get to a point where you're working full day. And that's so critically important because we found that 70% of the people who die of heat stress in the workplace die during the first week of work. And another very key aspect to that is it's not just about building up tolerance, it's about building up recognition of what your body can and can't do under those circumstances, recognizing the symptoms of onset of heat illness so that you're able to, slow down, drink water, do what you need to do in order to try to keep that under control and to identify it for someone else to help if you're in a situation that requires medical assistance. So all of those things are important. And I should note, when I say building up a tolerance, no one is ever going to be able to build up enough tolerance to work in 90 or 100-degree heat all day long without any kind of breaks or water or anything like that. The body just isn't capable of that. But we can get ourselves in a little bit better position than we were if we were used to sitting at a desk job in the air conditioning.
Right, yeah. And I think in a perfect world, there would be employers who recognize the different needs of their employees and the like, but that's a different conversation for a different day. I also want to talk about some history here, because you also outline in the report that already 50 years ago, there was a call by the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health to OSHA to adopt an occupational heat standard, and there still isn't one. And it's not like OSHA hasn't adopted other standards in the past 50 years, though as I've mentioned, I'd argue that we're still a long ways away from having generally just workplaces. But so I'm curious, Juley, what gives here? Why is the heat standard such an impossible get for OSHA?
Well, it has to do with a couple of different things. OSHA is only as strong as the guide. Excuse me. OSHA is only able to do its job if it's given the kind of resources and support needed to do its job from Congress. Congress passed the law that created OSHA and identified what their responsibilities were. But they also need to make sure that OSHA has the kind of funding it needs for adequate personnel to do what Congress has asked it to do. And right now, they are extremely under-resourced. They have been from the beginning. And that means we have, very little ability to actually get out and do a lot of investigation or enforcement of rules that are created. It also means that we have less staff that are able to devote, time to developing new standards. And then that's complicated by the fact that legislative language has been created, at various points across time that requires OSHA to jump through more and more hoops in order to get a rule created. And it's resulted in taking an average of 7 to 8 years for OSHA to create a rule from start to finish. And it's also been the case that OSHA has had limited ability to work on more than one rule at a time. So if you look at the rules that OSHA has created in the 50 years since it itself was created, is actually a relatively small number of rules for that time period, and a lot of things that haven't been effectively addressed. And all of this is a big reason for it. It's just not something that OSHA can easily and quickly accomplish. And the changing winds in the White House change priorities within each administration, which also are going to interfere with the ability to go through a 7 to 8 year process. So yes, 50 years before ultimately we saw it, a heat standard be prioritized by the Biden administration, so that it could be one of the ones that actually gets worked on. And they've been jumping through those hoops to get through the process they need to get through to finish up. They have reached a point where they have now created a proposed rule. That rule will go for hearings and public comment before they're able to create a final rule, which at this point won't be issued until at least 2026. So it's a long process. It's a long time coming. There's no way it ever should have taken this long. And yet here we are, and we just need to all work as fast as we can to get some protection for workers nationwide.
And how do you feel about this rule that's working its way through loops, through hoops at the moment? How do you feel about it as it's written right now?
The proposal that they've written is a strong one. It addresses all the areas of recommendation that come from science and worker health experts, and from the recommendations that have come from the CDC themselves. So it is something that the advocacy world, the worker rights and protection world are very satisfied with. Are there things that we would like to see as well? Yes. But in general, this is a very good proposal, a very good standard that advocates would be happy if it were implemented tomorrow.
Wouldn't it be nice, especially considering it's 100 degrees right now in Baltimore, and I can only imagine what it is in the rest of the country, particularly south of where I am. And I want to talk a little bit about the attacks on heat legislation, i.e., ensuring there's no protection for workers. And two of the hottest, if not the hottest states in the country, if you look at Public Citizen, and you have also released a very helpful map where it's mapping heat alerts. Texas is predominantly dark red, meaning that there were more than 60 heat alerts in most of those counties in a 5-month period last year. So Texas and Florida have passed legislation that prohibits protection of workers. Could you talk a little bit more about this specifically?
Sure. The first to get passed was the Texas bill, which is referred to as the Texas Death Star bill. It is broader than just preventing protections for workers against heat. It actually prevents local governments from creating any kind of regulations for employers across, sort of a broad range of categories. So not just labor related, any other issues. It prohibits the local areas from creating these kinds of protections. Although it does, within the legislation, specifically point out that that employers can't be required to give workers breaks. It's an extremely frustrating piece of legislation, not just for those who work on protecting workers from heat stress, but from many others that are working on protection. Texas is a very big state. They have 220 counties. It is, an area where different kinds of needs exist in different parts of the states. And local governments are elected for a reason. They're there because they want to protect the needs of their local area. So prohibiting them from stepping in and trying to provide the kinds of protections that the workers in their local jurisdiction need is really both ridiculous and completely against any principles of making sure that those workers get what they need. And the idea that was presented from Texas as to why they were doing this was that they wanted to make sure that there was consistency across the state. So that, for instance, if you have a chain business where you have stores in multiple counties, that they would all be dealing with the same kinds of rules, same standards that they have to meet. Unfortunately, we know that, first of all, that the needs are different in different counties, but also we know that Texas has never taken any steps as a state to put in protections for workers against heat stress. So, it's difficult to argue that they're just trying to make sure there's consistency if they're also not taking steps to do anything that needs to be done at the state level. The second state to jump in and do this was Florida. And what they did was monstrous. It was even more a more very specific attack on protecting workers from heat stress. Miami-Dade County, which is in the southern tip of Florida and is the hottest area of Florida, the area of Florida that received the most heat alerts last year and every year, was working on a standard to protect workers from heat in Miami-Dade County. They were a few weeks away from passing that through their oversight board and getting it implemented. That's when the state legislature stepped in to create a bill that would very specifically prohibit local jurisdictions from requiring employers to do anything to protect workers from heat. And they went so far, excuse me. Florida went so far as to specifically lay out all of the items that were listed in the protections from the Miami-Dade proposed rule. And these are the same protections that are, very broadly recommended by what we know of science and policy. It's said that specifically you can't require employers to have water for the workers or to provide them with any kind of breaks in a shaded or cool space. It prevents employers from putting in acclimatization procedures. It prevents any requirement that employers have education or training for their workers or their managers. It even prevents putting up any kind of signs or passing out any kind of written material to workers on the issue. And most frustratingly, most offensively, it prohibits any requirement for employers to have first aid on hand or emergency response procedures in place for what they will do when there is a heat stress emergency. So it's almost impossible for the Florida legislature to credibly claim that this was all about just getting consistency among the jurisdictions in terms of the way that employers must treat their workers. This very specifically targeted heat stress. It very specifically targeted a proposed standard that was about to be implemented in Miami-Dade. And the bill went so far as to prohibit the state legislature in Florida from creating a heat standard to protect the workers statewide for the next 2 years.
That is so arbitrary and so cruel. I'm also curious, I mean, because it seems like there are, even with what OSHA has in place, which isn't a lot, it seems like there would be things that clash with this kind of legislation, like the idea of not having first aid available. Thankfully, I've never had to work in Florida, but in other states that I've worked in, you have to have first aid available. So I'm curious if there are existing protections that clash with that kind of legislation, or existing protections that could allow states or even workers to bring this and say that, hey, existing OSHA protections say that you have to include this in how you care for your workers. Is there anything like that?
There are parts of the federal standards that exist through OSHA that can be applicable. As you said, employers are required to have certain kinds of first aid available, and those requirements were created through other standards that focused on things like construction injuries or something of the like. And those kinds of first aid kits and response systems are specific to those kinds of injuries and illnesses that we might expect from something like chemical use or something like that. They do not necessarily have the kinds of things that would be necessary to deal with someone who's experiencing heat exhaustion or heat stroke. There's nothing that's required to be in those kits to address that. And similarly, when it comes to emergency response, we obviously want to call an ambulance when medical attention is needed. And in most cases, it involves things like don't move the worker, the injured worker, while you wait for the ambulance. And minimal things that you should be doing to keep that worker from becoming further injured. And of course, to do things to stop bleeding if that's the case. But they don't have specific procedures about heat, which are critically important. When your body starts to overheat and your cooling systems, your natural cooling systems, start to break down and are unable to keep up, you can move from heat exhaustion to heat stroke in 15 minutes or less. So there is no time to just sit and wait until the emergency responders arrive. There has to be emergency help on site. I'm not talking about complex things. These are things that everybody can learn about. Dragging someone into the shade or inside to an air-conditioned space, using ice packs to try to cool them down, especially under like the armpits and in the groin area, and making sure that you're using sort of a cool cloth on their forehead and around their neck. Not forcing them to drink a lot of water because that can create its own problems. So those kinds of things are not built into the procedures that are already required with respect to first aid through OSHA. There's one other thing that is important to know as well, and that is that OSHA does not have requirements for breaks during work, which is absolutely mind-boggling when you think about it, because regardless of experiencing heat stress, workers need breaks in order to be able to physically recover from whatever it is they're experiencing, including just the physicality of their work, and the mental pressures and focus that are required for their work. And being able to have those breaks enables them to catch up and be productive again. And the fact that OSHA hasn't gotten around to even requiring breaks is kind of insane.
Yeah, it's very insane. Although I guess it's not that surprising. I mean, considering the labor history of this country and how hard it's tried to specifically target those speaking up for workers, it really shouldn't, like the saying goes, if you know the history, then the present isn't that shocking. And I'm curious, with regards to people that are fighting on this issue, Public Citizen also has something called the Heat Stress Network, which is a campaign with over 120 organizations that have joined in support for worker heat protections. Juley, could you talk a little bit more about this campaign and specifically like what kind of demands and goals y'all have?
Well, the organizations that are involved actually, have a variety of kinds of issues they focus on, and many of them not related to heat stress, but we all have in common that desire and need to address heat stress in workers. The organizations within the network come from, workers' rights and unions, and also come from climate world, and come from the health world, and scientific experts in worker health and safety, and even some others who are faith-based, and just lots and lots of organizations who all recognize this problem, and all want to see it get effectively addressed. And we know that when it comes to working on anything in Washington, the broader range of people you have who are fighting for something, the more likely it is that that is to occur. And that's the purpose of bringing these folks together. And our goal has been to try to get protections in place and enforceable at OSHA. We've used multiple tactics to try to do that, including obviously petitioning OSHA directly to create a rule. We've also worked on trying to get legislation passed in Congress, and continue to work on that, because, as I said, we're still a couple of years away from seeing a final rule come out from OSHA, just because when the necessary steps that still remain, whereas Congress could direct OSHA to issue an interim heat standard tomorrow, an immediately enforceable standard that could be protecting the workers right now in this 100-degree heat. And so this legislation we're working on in Congress would do that, would direct OSHA to create this interim heat standard that would be in place until a final standard is issued, whether that's 2 years from now or 20 years from now. There would be something protective in place. And we have 110 co-sponsors of the legislation in the House. We have 20 co-sponsors in the Senate. We continue to work on that and will continue to work on that even as OSHA is working on trying to finalize their rule. So that's the kind of advocacy that we as a broad network are able to provide. Also, as a broad network, we're able to bring in information and expertise on a lot of different ways that this impacts workers. We have all sorts of worker groups and unions that focus on specific kinds of employment: construction, farm workers, restaurant workers, bricklayers, you name it, they're there, and are helping us understand the individual issues in their types of work. And also giving us a basis for making sure that whatever is in the standard does apply across the board in a way that's going to equally protect all of those types of workers.
And this kind of interim OSHA protection, that would override what Florida and Texas have done, correct?
Yes, it will. Anytime OSHA puts a standard in place, it becomes the workplace standard for all private employers throughout the country. An individual state can create a rule that is stronger than the standard put out by the federal OSHA, but they cannot put out anything that is weaker. So that means that any attempts to block those kinds of protections will immediately evaporate because they will be required to follow the federal OSHA standard in Texas and in Florida. And it also means that even a few of these state rules that already exist will have to be strengthened to meet the federal heat standard or exceed it if that's what they choose to do.
And I'm just curious, I mean, it's hard to think right now of a time when it will be cold and snowy and icy, but I'm thinking in particular of states that reach, -40 and things in the winter. Is there a push to have this expanded to kind of like an overall climate protection so that workers who then have to work outside, I don't know, like railroad workers or things like that, when it's -40, would also have protections under something like this?
It is important to protect workers in those circumstances. And it is a sort of policy issue on the back burner, if you will. There are not as prevalent and not as many injuries and deaths due to cold than there are due to hot. But still, it is a critical mass of individuals that should not be experiencing those kinds of problems at work. There are protections that can be put in place, but the protections differ quite a bit from the kinds of things you need to do to protect workers from heat. Our body systems that cool us are different from the ones that warm us up. And so, everything that we're doing when we're talking about cooling workers effectively is about how we work with the existing cooling systems to augment what they're doing in our body and enable them to be able to control the heat that's there. We need to be able to do that the same way when we talk about augmenting the systems in our body that keep us warm in cold conditions. And so that's something that requires a different knowledge base that is driving it and is able to create policies that are more specific to that particular danger in workplaces. And hopefully it won't be long off before that begins as well. I will say, though, that with the increased global annual warming that we've seen in the last few years, well, actually, that we've seen a pattern of for the past 40 years, but has become particularly intense in recent years. There's been less focus on addressing the cold. Not only are we experiencing, ridiculous heat in the summertime, we're not getting the same kind of cold temperatures in general or as often in the wintertime. And so there's just been less of a perceived need for that kind of standard in light of the sort of desperate need for the heat standard that we're facing.
Yeah, absolutely. Great point. And it makes me feel like there should just be like a climate change worker bill that like deals with floods and droughts and fires and like all of the things that we're facing as workers and as human beings because the climate is in such chaos right now.
It is a complicated thing, and there are going to be a lot of effects from different kinds of climate change disasters and just general changing in temperatures and that are going to affect things like vector-borne illnesses and different kinds of products that will need to be used in order to keep plants alive that also have toxic effects on humans. Things like that we're going to have to sort of catch up and deal with each one as the issues arise. And I will note that because of the fire season that, if you will, that we have in, most of the western half of the United States. Smoke inhalation has become a big problem, and a couple of these states that have addressed heat stress have companion standards that address the issue of smoke, so that they're dealing with how those things combine, not just how we address them separately, because we have a lot of workers in those areas, outdoor workers who are out trying to do their work in the heat, wearing bandanas, and barely able to see 10 feet away because of the smoke in the air. And so, hopefully there will be more and more states that address that, although hopefully there'll be less states where that will be a need. It doesn't seem to be the direction we're going in terms of climate change, though.
No, indeed, it does not. It's a quite dystopian, to be honest. But we battle on, and I'm very grateful that you are battling on this issue, Juley. Where's the best place for folks to stay up to date on this issue?
If you want to go to citizen.org and just put in the search bar Heat Stress Network, you can click on that web page that I try to keep as up to date as I possibly can. It has all sorts of information. It has access to all of the reports that I've written on the issue that have focused on different aspects of the problem. But it also has reports from other allied organizations who are part of this heat stress network, where they have come at it from another perspective. Union of Concerned Scientists addressing it from the climate change aspect. We have a report from restaurant opportunity centers that addresses specifically what restaurant workers are up against, and workers who are working back in the kitchen making your food. And so lots of information up there and resources, and hopefully you find what you need, or within those items that are up there, you'll see an awful lot of them have extensive footnoting and are great assistance as well in trying to locate information if you don't see it within any of the reports or blogs that are currently there.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Juley. I really appreciate you taking the time to sit down with us and contextualizing this and giving us this very important information. I appreciate it.
I appreciate the willingness of you to cover this and to help us get the word out, not only in order to make sure that workers get protected, but it also helps to educate the public of just how dangerous heat is, and their own personal need to learn about it and learn about how to avoid getting a heat illness or a heat injury, and how to see the problems when others are experiencing them and get them help very quickly. So it's an area that we all need education to deal with all aspects of what's happening in our lives this summer.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Thanks again, Juley. Appreciate it.
Happy to have you. Happy to be here.